and very welcome. We're in week 6 of our onboarding program. Extraordinary, and it's extraordinary how many amazing presentations we've had in the last 6 weeks. This is the second last one for our rotation. On Wednesday night, we're going to have a presentation on the aggressive patient. I'll tell you a bit more about that at the end. And most of our presentations has been very clinically orientated, because when you start brand new at your rural hospital or wherever you're starting as a doctor, that's your priority, is some of the clinical things that need to be sorted out. But a large part of medicine is actually the skill of also dealing with people. And so tonight is our one sort of soft skill session, and it's going to be very much a coaching session and actually helping you pick up some tools and skills that I hope will be useful to you. So how can you manage difficult patients with, just the right touch? How can you navigate complicated relationships at the workplace and at home? And how can you thrive and not just survive as a doctor? And all of these topics are topics that we have been picking up at all of our rural onboarding trainings over the last couple of years in different aspects. And I've noticed there's some basics that I always cover, no matter which one of these topics that I cover. And so we've created something that's actually going to look at all of these different aspects, but all based on the same understanding of how the human being works. So when you do HIV, to be able to understand HIV, you have to do immunology and understand how the immune system works, and you have to do your HIV virology and understand how the HIV virus works, and only then does actually ARVs and all of everything else make sense. And it's exactly the same when you want to start working with difficult relationships, and we're going to talk a lot about stress today, but I still find that sometimes our understanding of the neurophysiology of stress is still a little bit basic. And if we don't understand in depth on what actually happens in the brain when people are stressed, we can't actually intervene either in ourselves or in those around us. So part 1 of today's presentation is going to be looking very much at the anatomy of stress. That's going to be the first half an hour. And then the second half an hour, we're going to actually look at then, great, now that we know and understand what happens when people are stressed, how do we now moderate and modulate what happens after that? So we'll start with a little story. This is March 2020. It's just the beginning of COVID. We had that first patient diagnosed in South Africa on the 5th of March, and all of the hospitals were getting busy. So I was working at Nkobela TB Hospital, and I had all my insulation tape ready, and yellows and reds, and we were busy marking things on floors and getting our wards ready. And I didn't have any patients yet with COVID, but there was terror on the wards. And then, of course, when the first people were diagnosed, it wasn't patients, it was nurses. So on the POI ward, where we were busy getting ready, we were called that morning that 2 of our nurses were off with COVID symptoms and had been tested. And of course, in those days also, it took 3, 5, at some stage a week to even just get the results back, because there was this massive backlog at the time. And I arrived in the morning in the ward, and the nurse who was in charge that morning had a complete meltdown and was insisting that we should put all of the nurses immediately on quarantine because they all had lunch together the previous day, and was insisting that we organize defumigation, one of those big things where they were going to come and defumigate the whole ward. And I, of course, decided to manage, my poor distressed nurse and whip out my COVID guidelines to explain to her why all of this was not necessary. And then conversation escalated. And at one point, she shouted, literally, I think it was heard all across the ward, "You don't care if we die." And I think at that point, I actually realized I needed to leave the room. And to put that all into context, this was the March, and in February of that year, I had just presented Thriving in Rural Health here in Kinsa. It was one of our first rural onboarding programs, and I taught a lot of this stuff I'm going to teach you tonight. And so the only thing that I had at that point was at least I knew why things were going wrong. But even though we understand quite often the theory of what happens and what we should or shouldn't do, why do we still behave and say and do all the wrong things in these very high stress situations? So what we're going to look at today is how do we deal with interactions where you or the other person is under high levels of stress? And actually, it's not so much about teaching you how to do the brilliant thing that's going to calm it all down and how I was going to say exactly the right thing, but it's just about how not to make a bad situation worse, which is basically what I did that day. I took a stressful situation and we escalated it nicely into a proper crisis. Just to say later on, we made up and it was all fine and we survived the COVID epidemic. But it's not so simple when pressures are running high. So great. So here's the neuroscience of why people, even you, sometimes are a pain in the ass. And with neuroscience, I'm going to talk a lot today about the limbic brain. So just to remind you, that's that central part in the brain, old part of the brain that's been around for centuries and is responsible for survival. And then we've got this newer part of our brain sitting in the front here, the prefrontal cortex. Needs a sexier name, but anyway, we're going to have to call it the prefrontal cortex. And that is a newer part, later part of our evolution. And these two have to work together. So I want to remind you, we'll start with some of the basics of what you know, is that as human beings, we are always in one of two modes. You can think of it as two different states of being. You can think of it as almost two different landscapes that we operate in throughout our days. No matter who we are, it's part of the human condition. The one of them is run by our sympathic system. You're going, oh, I remember that from medical school, which is your survival mode. So whenever there's a threat, your fight-flight system comes into gear. And you know this because you describe this to your poor patient who's having panic attacks, right? So you're going to remember when you're feeling stressed, your blood pressure goes up, your heart rate goes up, you know, your gastrointestinal system doesn't get any blood supply, your muscles go all tense. And then you are in survival mode. And of course, if that overshoots, that's where we see our panic attacks. On the other side of the spectrum, when you don't have any adrenaline in the body, then we can be in creative mode. And I like the word creative mode. It's nicer than prefrontal cortex. But this is the mode when actually the prefrontal cortex will now be predominant in the way that our neurophysiological thinking is functioning. And we're now able to have access to all of our higher brain functions. And this is when the parasympathetic system is in charge. And if you remember with the parasympathetic system, the blood pressure goes down, pulse goes down, and generally we are in a much more calm and relaxed state. So there's always these two modes. What we don't realize is that these modes don't only change what's happening in your muscular system and happening in your physiology and your blood pressure and your heart rate, but it changes the way you think. And that's the tricky bit, because when you are in a state, you think that that is the only way to be. So the two states that we're going to look at here is your survival mode, which is always led by that limbic brain, survival brain, or creative mode, always led by prefrontal cortex. And of course, there's a spectrum. You can be extremely stressed, or you can be extremely creative and relaxed. And there's also a neutral button. You're busy brushing your teeth and not thinking about much else. But if we compare and contrast these two states, because they're two different modes, you're either in one or the other in the extremes, is that in survival mode, you are in what we call fast thinking versus slow thinking. We're going to go through all of these. I'm going to talk about the jungle versus the temple. That's our emotional landscape when we are in these states. And we're going to talk about something called the chimp versus the sage. And some of you that's been to some of my previous talks will have heard about the chimp before. So let's start off with slow and fast thinking. So we're always going to talk about what happens when you're in survival mode versus what happens when you are in creative mode. And in this state, I'm looking at particularly how that affects the way we think. So the book I'm drawing on is an amazing book written by Daniel Kahneman. He's won a Nobel Prize in economics, and his field of interest is behavioral science. So he studies how people behave and why they behave like they do. And anybody who's interested in bias and want to know why and how we are biased, this is the Bible on bias. It describes all the studies and all the evidence and research we have on bias and all the different types of biases out there. So just to have a little bit of an experience of slow and fast thinking, we're going to make it a little bit interactive. You're going to interact with yourselves, I'm afraid. But I just want you to do a little exercise for me. So firstly, I want you to look at this woman, and let's put that in the chat. Let's make that a bit more fun. And just tell me, what emotion do you think she's experiencing at the moment? You can just pop into the chat, find your chat button, and just write for me what you think it is. There we go. We've got some comments. Oh, I've got anger. I've got irritation, anger, annoyance. Great, that's very quick. Okay, so now the second exercise, that was system 1, is now I would like you, just for the next 10 seconds, to do this sum in your head. No calculators, not allowed to do on a piece of paper, and just quickly multiply 17 by 24 for me in your head. And now there's all of you sitting there out there, I'm not doing that, I'm tired, it's been a long day. But just there, you've had an experience of what it's like when you're using system 1 in your thinking. And system 1 is the very closely related to our limbic brain and very much run by our limbic brain, and is our ability to make decisions very quickly. So whenever you're reading a facial expression, whenever you're driving down the road and you unconsciously read all the newspaper headlines, whenever you're seeing something on Facebook and you have a very quick opinion about it or a very quick thought about it, your system 1 is in play. And what's great about system 1 is it's really quick. Can come up with an idea or a decision or opinion very, very quickly. And it's usually just takes very little energy. It's easy. So literally, if you were to go and look in the brain and see how much sugar it's burning while you did this, it's not very much sugar at all. Now, this system 2, this is a different story altogether. And you would have had an experience when you tried to do that maths. Oh, this is much harder. I now have to concentrate. If I'm tired, I don't even feel like doing so. And it's going to take more time. And literally, if I measured how much sugar you were burning, you'll be burning a lot more sugar. Lovely. Yes. Oh, and I've got some answers there. I'm going to go with 408 just because 2 people got to 408. So let's just look at those 2 worlds first in terms of thinking. So fast thinking, as I said, is that automatic, it's easy. And that's all of our emotional thinking. One of my favorite sayings of this part of the brain is always, I don't feel like it, or I do feel like it, or I don't feel like it. This is where we make all our assumptions. So when you're in survival mode, you don't take a long time to decide whether something is dangerous or not. If you're walking down a path and something's rustling in the grass, it might be a snake, and so I jump this way. And so you guess, and you make assumptions about what's happening in the world around you on sometimes quite minimal information. And that's the basis of most bias. Whether it's confirmation bias or narrative bias, we find easier ways to answer our questions by making assumptions about the world around us. This kind of thinking is unstable, it's inconsistent. Today I think that, tomorrow I think something different, and it loves to jump to an opinion. Oh, the world of social media, that's the, Twitter is like the trumpet for our fast thinking system, where you see something, you hear something, you read something, and immediately you have an opinion, and of course, share button, share button. And this thinking is very black and white. So it's not going to get very differentiated. It's not going to get very creative. Things are either right or things are either wrong. When you think of your slow thinking, remember when you did that sum, you have to apply focus and attention, and it takes effort. It's harder to do. As a matter of fact, it's quite hard to do this when you're tired or when you're emotional, because of this effort that you actually have to do to overcome that inertia. And this is the part of our brain where we interpret information, try and get to the facts. It's when you read that paper and try and figure out what's going on. This is where our evidence-based, rational, logical thinking comes in. And this is now where you can think in context and with perspective. You understand the larger side of things. You can see the broader spectrum of what is actually going on. You're less likely to be the victim of something like bias. And now you have a lot of shades of gray. You understand that, with the COVID vaccination, there are pros and there are cons. It might be different in different communities, how you think about it. You understand the challenges of public health versus the challenges of evidence-based medicine. And out of that, you have to make a decision in terms of what's best for your patient. And so out of this comes a balanced judgment rather than this is wrong and that is right. So that was to do with our thinking. And the second part of what we're going to look at is sort of the emotional landscape of this survival brain, which I'm going to call the jungle. And again, from our prefrontal cortex, you can imagine being down in the jungle where you can only see what's immediately ahead of you, and being out on the top of the hill, on the mountain, or in the temple, and being able to look out over a whole landscape below you. So when we talk about the jungle, now again, we're in that limbic brain, right? Chimp. Then we'll talk about chimp mode in a minute. We're in survival mode. And the purpose of your limbic brain is obviously very clear. It's survival. And it's been like that since from the very beginning, when the first cavemen came out of their caves. That is there to keep us safe. And similar to the animal kingdom, it's very much guided by what we call sympathy and antipathy. So what do we like and what do we not like? And generally, we are drawn towards what is good for us, our drives, and we have antipathy and we run away from things that might harm us or might be dangerous to us. So these instincts and drives are sort of built into our limbic system. We're born with them. And the classic instinct we know very well is our fight, flight, freeze response. So whenever you don't feel safe, your limbic system will kick in your fight, flight, freeze with that adrenaline, and it's linked to our complex endocrine system, and all kinds of things happen that changes our physiology. But it also has very strong drives. So the drives we're looking at here is the kinds of things that will perpetuate the survival of the species, if you would like. So of course, food is a major drive. You ever try to do any proper thinking, try and do maths when you're hungry, your survival brain will not allow you to do that. It's busy trying to focus on what's important for survival. You want to feel safe, you want to feel secure. Sex, important, very much belongs to the world of the jungle, the world of that survival brain. Our troop, who's our family, who's our community, feeling protective over our family and our community, the protective instinct of parents, for example, for their children lives in this area. Territory, what belongs to mine, what belongs to somebody else, where does my territory end and where does somebody else's territory begin? A very ancient drive. And then, of course, dominance and power. And in the world we live, well, at the moment, with everything happening in the Ukraine, we can feel what that's like when we're in the world of the jungle. And that's the kinds of things that becomes important. Who is the strongest? Who is the biggest? Who can overpower somebody else? And that belongs to our survival brain. And it's very ancient. And I like to use the term street view. And you know those video games, always like to give that example. This is actually a screenshot out of a video game where you're down either in the little streets in the village or you're out in the jungle and you can only see what's immediately ahead of you, and you're only looking for baddies and you're only trying to survive. You're not able to see the bigger picture of what's going on. You are sort of in that thickly dense jungle. So let's go to the other side. So now we're in creative mode. Our adrenaline is low. Still the same person. These are not two different people, same person. But now you are with the prefrontal cortex is predominantly in play, and the prefrontal cortex has got different priorities. And so this is where self-fulfillment comes from. Where if you think about evolution, we talk about survival of the fittest, fair enough, but how does self-fulfillment and meaning and purpose got anything to do with survival of the fittest? And it doesn't. It belongs to a different part of ourselves, a part of ourselves that's evolved later than that survival brain. And so here we're actually operating not on the laws of the jungle, which is all about survival, but now we operate in the laws of society. And here lies all our powerful ethical and moral drives. So what is important to me? What is important to us as a society? What is important to us as people? And here you have your qualities such as honesty, compassion, empathy for the others. You're able to think in terms of stepping into somebody else's shoes. You now have a conscience. You start thinking about, well, what is right? What is not right? You're thinking in terms of what the laws say. And here you're starting to have self-control, and self-control always talks about how these higher ideas or higher values or higher meanings have to put a lead on that survival instincts of ours. So I need to eat now, but actually there's some things I'm going to need to do before I eat, or I feel like having that cookie, but today I'm not having cookies because I'm on healthy eating day. Or actually, I don't feel like studying, but I've got an exam tomorrow, so I'm going to sit down now and work through this textbook. So all of that is this ability to actually control these instincts and these drives, which are all so much living in the present. And just note that it takes effort, it takes attention and sugar. And very much within this is where we're able to be tolerant. This is where we're able to be flexible. This is where we're able to be understanding of others around us. And you can see these are all the qualities that are absent in the current Russian-Ukraine crisis. These are not the qualities that is coming into play. It's all the world of the jungle that is in play there in this invasion. So the third area, the third metaphor I'm going to use, and I love using these metaphors because they're very useful also when I explain things to patients. And when I do a lot of school doctoring work in terms of teenagers and adolescents, and also working with teachers. And then these metaphors are very helpful in terms of trying to understand how these different parts of us work. And here I'm always standing on the shoulders of other giants, not my own metaphor. This chimp term comes from Prof. Steve Peters. He's a psychiatrist, wrote a great book called The Chimp Paradox already several years ago now, where he describes this neurophysiology and these beautiful metaphors. And the chimp here for us is going to be a picture of our kind of way we behave when we are in survival brain mode. So when we're in survival brain mode, our inner chimp is in charge. And when we're in prefrontal mode, we have this higher being, which I like calling the sage. Shazad, I think Steve Peters actually refers to this as the human. But we're going to talk about our inner chimp and then our inner sage. And depending on your adrenaline level, remember, either one of these two modes are in charge. So what is chimp behavior all about? So how does this chimp behave, and why does it do what it do? And it has two basic functions. The first most important function is to manage whatever threat there is. So whatever it likes or doesn't like, it's going to react to that in some sort of way. But more importantly, is it tries to reduce that anxiety. So the chimp is actually only supposed to pick up if there's a problem and then let your higher functions know that there's a problem so they can deal with it. But we don't like feeling anxious as human beings. If you've ever had a bit of a panic attack or a bit of anxiety, you get that sick feeling in your stomach, your whole body feels unwell. And the biggest aim you have is just to reduce your anxiety. And it's got interesting ways of doing that. The chimp lives very much in the present. So it only thinks about what it likes now. So right now, I feel like it or I don't feel like it. It's all about fun. So everybody who knows teaching children, for example, if you can make it fun, you're already halfway there. And the chimp's obviously very self-focused because it lives within the laws of the jungle. So it's all about survival of me or survival of the ones I love. It's quite proud. At the same time, it can be quite insecure. And very important, it has this vigilance, this paranoia, because it always has to look out for threats. So what the chimp does is it always wants to see what is possibly threatening, what is possibly unsafe. And one of the ways it easily decides if something unsafe is if it's something that it's not aware of or doesn't know or hasn't come across. And this is the basis of all our prejudice and all the isms. So whether it's racism or homophobia or transphobia or sexism or any scenario where you have somebody feeling negatively inclined towards somebody that's not like them, that's that paranoia that's coming into play. I don't know it. It's not familiar to me. I don't know what it is. I don't understand it. It's not like me. And so the first reaction is to have a negative reaction to that. And of course, if you now start playing into that, then that eventually becomes actually changes your behavior towards other groups of people. And when the chimp judges the world around it, it's very emotive judgment. And that partly makes it feel a little bit more in control. So it looks at the world and things are either bad or good. And if it's bad, it's very bad. Social media, again, emotive judgment is very, very prevalent in our social media circles. The second, the other part we want to look at is now, how does that look like when we are in prefrontal mode? So we've all had chimp days, and we all have had chimp moments every day, and we all have had days where we were in chimp mode the whole day. But then we have those days where we're not very stressed, where we're able to stay calm, and the sage is able to observe and see what's happening and respond to what's coming towards them. And I love calling this balcony view. So that's the ability to not be down in the street fighting baddies, but being able to look out and see what's going to happen in the future, what's happened in the past, and how best to modify that. So when it is in those scenarios, whatever comes toward it is able to respond with perspective. It's able to see the bigger picture. Here is where one actually has the ability to experience joy. There's this lovely book called The Book of Joy, written together by Archbishop Tutu and the Dalai Lama. And you have that lovely picture of how two people who very much live from their sage side of themselves and the deep inner joy they find in the world. The sage is empathic. It is generous. It is humble. And I always give the example, when you are in survival mode and you're busy running away from that lion, you can't go and think about shame. Poor lion, might be hungry, they're getting extinct, At that stage, you can only think about yourself. That is what the chimp is supposed to do. It's only when you're able to not be in survival mode that you can suddenly start thinking, well, what is happening with somebody else and how do I best help that person? Whenever we are creative, whenever we are innovative, whenever we are on those best cells, when you have that day in OPD where you're just doing good work, you are actually in that part and that mode of yourself. And this is one of my favorite sentences. Everybody who's heard me teach when we talk about this. This is from Brene Brown, talking about being generous in our assumptions. So all of us are always in these two modes. And when you run into people, you don't always know what's going on in their lives. And so sometimes we run into people, whether it's in the post office or a patient or a nurse or any scenario, where in that day they are in chimp mode. They are stressed, they are worried, and they are behaving not at their best. And wouldn't it be wonderful if we lived in a world where when we are in chimp mode or when we come across other people in chimp mode, we can be generous in our assumptions about why they're behaving like that. So quite often we would like to classify people, that person is a bitch, or that person is an arsehole, or that person is a control freak. But actually, maybe they're just very stressed. So the interesting thing to remember here is that the switch between being in stress mode, survival mode, chimp mode, and being in creative mode, sage mode, prefrontal cortex, is adrenaline. This is physiological. This is not just a philosophical state of being that you choose to be in. Today I'll be a nice person, and today I'll be my lesser nice person. This thing is determined physiologically by what is happening in your adrenal glands, and it's always triggered by fear. So whenever you're feeling insecure or you're feeling not sure about something, your adrenaline goes up and your behavior is going to change as a result. And there are three types of levels of safety that we experience that might make that adrenaline triggers. So again, Ukraine is such a terrible example at the moment. We all need to feel safe bodily. I think 1.5 million people have fled the Ukraine. You imagine when your suburbs, your neighbors, your cities are being bombed. And that is a very basic. If we feel unsafe bodily, of course, that adrenaline has to kick in. But we also have a huge need to feel safe emotionally. We feel a need to be loved and to be included. So if you're in a scenario where you're being criticized, or where somebody is stonewalling you, or where somebody's ignoring you, or where somebody's treating you as if you don't matter, or throwing you out of a house, for example, or out of a company, that can be extraordinarily stressful. And then we also want to have the freedom of choice. We want to be able to be free to express who we are and to live the lives that we want to live. We want to choose how we respond to the world, what kind of job we want to do, what kind of identity, gender identity we have. We want to be able to have those choices and for those choices to be respected. And when we feel that we're not able to be who we are, that can also cause stress. And you remember the Maslow, you've got your little Maslow triangle with all those different needs. All of those are encompassed in these three levels of feeling safe bodily, emotionally, and from a freedom of choice point of view. So in terms of how they work together, it's important to realize, if you think of your consciousness as like a vehicle that goes through life or through your biography, the chimp's always driving. You don't have a choice about that. Our limbic system and our survival system, all our sense organs feed information into our limbic system. So whatever we see, whatever we hear, whatever's happening in our body goes to the limbic system first. And the chimp is always screening. So it's sitting in that, looking at the environment, seeing what's coming in, and it has to decide, is it safe, is it not safe, is it safe, is it not safe? If things are safe, then it relaxes, and then your cerebral cortex, you're either on those automatic behaviors, like when you're driving to work, or when you're seeing patients, you can get on with the business of the day. If there's any sign that things are unsafe, then the chimp's going to trigger this fight-flight response. And what's supposed to happen is this is supposed to now just make suggestions to the captain of the ship. It's like that alarm button going off, you know, the red, wah, 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 oh, danger, danger, danger. And then ideally the captain or the sage or your prefrontal, from your higher person, you're supposed to look at what's happening and make a decision. The challenge, of course, is if the chimp ends up being the one that's driving the ship and you get locked in the trunk of the car, like the Hulk, for those of you that are Marvel fans, because the chimp on its own is only going to make trouble. It's not quite as bright as your higher functions. So all of that lovely explanation that we've done over the last, where my time was, good, almost just a half an hour. Why are people difficult? It's because they are stressed. So to make it a little bit more interesting, we're going to look at what this chimp now does to try and bring down its anxiety. And here I'm drawing on the work of Shujaat Chamin. He wrote an amazing book called Positive Intelligence, very worthwhile looking at his website. You can go and do a questionnaire to see what your own saboteurs are. And these mechanisms are actually very well known. They're well described as defense mechanisms, etc. There's different words that are used for them by the psychologists. He's put them in a nice framework. And these are mechanisms we use to reduce our anxiety. So while we're little and when we are children, these mechanisms are created to make, when we're in scenarios where we're feeling unsafe and we're trying to make ourselves a little bit less anxious, we can't fix whatever is happening, we find these ways to make ourselves feel like we're actually a little bit more in control of what's happening. And they're actually complex patterns of behaviors. And the important thing is the purpose of the behavior unconsciously is to reduce that anxiety level and make you feel a little bit less sick with anxiety. Now, they're quite good in physical threats. It works very well if you have to decide something really quickly and get out of the way of that lion, but they're really stupid when you're having to deal with a complex scenario or a complex relationship interaction, for example. So you don't want these behaviors to try and solve the problem because they're not good at solving problems. They're only there to reduce anxiety. Shazad has put them into a framework. I've slightly adapted it just for easy teaching. And I'm giving you the description here of 9 activities that we might do that will make us feel less anxious, but might not serve our best interest. So when people are in chimp mode, they might behave in this manner. And usually, most of the time, it makes things worse. So you can see they divided here in the left between fight, freeze, and flee. So it's our fight, flight, freeze response. And under our fight response, probably the most common thing that all of us do when we're feeling a little bit stressed is we criticize. I either criticize myself, I either criticize the other person, I would criticize the government, we criticize the, government's always the favorite to put everything on, but it gives us the ability to feel a little bit more in control, and it does not necessarily solve what's happening. And quite often in a relationship scenario, if you start criticizing and attacking, it's definitely going to make things worse. Lots of doctors like to overanalyze. We overanalyze the other person. We overanalyze while we think things are going on, and usually with a little bit of a negative bias because we're stressed, or your control freaks trying to manipulate everybody else around them to try and reduce their stress. We can also do things where we're not fighting or not fleeing. So we can become super fixated on details, meaning we become anal about all the dotting the I's and crossing the T's, anal about our desk organization, anal about being best in the class. Some people who are not good at fighting at all might resort to pleasing, so doing whatever they think the other person wants them to do just to be able to reduce their anxiety, and quite often sacrificing their own needs in a process. I'm sure some of you will relate. And then worrying is also a common one that lots of people do. So you're lying in bed at night, whatever has happened in the morning, and now your head's going tick, 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 tick. And then lastly, avoiding. So you're fleeing mechanisms. So doctors feeling stressed about something that's happened at work, you're having an interaction with the staff that's not good and just don't show up for work or just doesn't come back after lunch. That's an extreme example. Feeling very sorry for ourselves, we all do that. Why me? I always get the worst calls and nobody actually cares. Nobody comes and asks me how I'm doing. Of course, you're allowed to feel like this. It just is not necessarily all that helpful. And then distracting, we all do this as well. So we all like to, this is of course the seeds of all of our addictions. So people use, whether it's cigarettes or alcohol or drugs or sex or Netflix binging, or find activities that distracts them from their anxiety. So these activities in themselves, it's not bad to be kind and nice to others. It's not bad to sometimes step away out of a conflict. It's not bad to actually have moments when we have these stressed moments and these activities come to the fore to reduce our anxiety for a bit. But in general, if you're going to use any of these to try and solve the problem, generally you're going to make things worse. The next thing to understand is that now you know those 9 different, and I'm sure you've all found the 1 or 2 that might be your own personal preference or your partner's personal preference. But just to remember how you feel if somebody criticizes or shouts at you for anything. If somebody ignores you or stonewalls you, you're standing in the home affairs queue and the person is not even recognizing your existence. If somebody's trying to manipulate you and trying to get you to do something that you don't want to do. Or if you're sitting in a meeting coming up with ideas and all you're getting back is negativity. No, that won't work. Oh, we've tried to do this. Oh no, that's complete nonsense. So all of these are activities where somebody's in chimp mode, feeling a little bit stressed, adrenaline is high, and so they are doing all of these things to try and bring down their own anxiety. What happens is it makes you feel unsafe. And so what happens? A chimp action will also elicit an even greater chimp reaction from the other person. And this is where I had that lovely example with my dear nurse. I obviously was going into analysis mode to try and bring down her anxiety. She was feeling unsafe because she was not feeling heard and feeling more and more anxious. And so we suddenly got into this chimp reaction thing going on, which was simply escalating and not solving the problem. Any scenario where you're in a conversation with somebody and you can feel the conversation is getting worse and worse and worse, there's a very good chance that you are on one of those 2 sides. So now we're going to do something that's going to be fun. So usually when we try and talk about how do you manage the difficult patient, we all brainstorm on what would be the best thing to say. Well, that's quite boring and also quite complicated because scenarios are so individualized. What's more fun and what's more interesting and I think more important is to be able to recognize what the chimp tends to do in these difficult scenarios. So what we're going to do, I'm going to give you some scenarios and I'm going to ask you in the chat to write for me what you can do in that scenario to make things worse. Ha ha ha. Much more fun. Okay, so we're not going to worry about coming up with what will be the nice and the best thing to say in that scenario, but what kind of things might we do? What kind of things you might have done. Maybe you've seen a colleague do it. If everybody's always behaving perfectly at your facility, maybe from Grey's Anatomy, Surg Med. We've got a 32-year-old woman from a private practice on daily Ativan. Doctor, I cannot sleep without these tablets. If I don't sleep, my day is like a living nightmare. For those of you that don't know what Ativan is, it's like a benzo, short-acting benzo they like using in private. There's no other treatment for my panic attacks. Nothing else works. And then when you start to try and, mention that maybe we don't have Ativan in public sector, you have no idea how unwell I have been. All you doctors are the same. You have your nice fat salaries and your easy lives, but you don't care about the hell I'm going through here. So just to remind you of our different chimp activities, and you're welcome to put in the chat 4 or 5 examples of how you might make this conversation a lot worse. So you can see Sally here. She's criticizing, she's manipulating, right? She's feeling very stressed. She's using those methods to try and get some more of this Ativan. She's very nervous we're not going to prescribe. And of course, she's using the Ativan in the first place to possibly cope with some issues in the past. Anybody brave? Yeah, yes, exactly. I like that. Tell her exactly how difficult it is working where you do. There we go. Nice defense one. I don't work at the pharmacy. Excellent. Oh, I'm sure we can have a. So we can either be over explaining, over analyzing, worrying too much, self-blaming, not being positive. Excellent. So quite the classic thing is either being defensive and trying to explain to her exactly how difficult your own life is. Telling her she's addicted, telling her she's difficult. Excellent. Very good. Don't worry, we're going to come back to these later. I'm actually going to jump on just from a time point of view. So that was a patient example. Let's go to a team member example. It's a really busy day in OPD with massive queues, and each patient seems to be more complicated than the last one. You've got an elderly patient with severe dehydration. You need to drip her and send her to the ward, not a nurse in sight. You find a nurse in the tea room, just sitting down with her cup of tea, and you ask her to come and help. Oh, no, doctor, I'm on my lunch break now. You can put it up. Also, our nurse here, and quite often here when you find people getting very insistent about their breaks, and they're out now, there's usually a lot of victim feeling coming into there. They're feeling a bit overwhelmed, or they're not quite managing, obviously distracting herself as well from stress and not wanting to engage. So that's some of her stuff. So what kind of things can you say at this moment that will make this conversation considerably worse? I'm sure you've all had this scenario with a team member. Oh, people thinking, no, we're always very... Tell her how long it's been since your last tea break. Yes, excellent. Oh, I never take lunch. We don't get tea breaks as doctors. At least I care about patients and not about eating. Ooh, ouch. Yes, I will report you. Excellent. Yes, you only think of yourself. Very good. If you eat too much, you're going to have diabetes. Yep, that definitely should do it. No wonder you're overweight. Ouch, ouch. Okay, excellent. See, this is fast thinking. We can come up with 1,000 examples very easily. Okay, third one. Now we're going to get a bit more closer to home. You're on call on a Friday night. It's the end of the month. You arrive home, 9 o'clock in the morning. You're exhausted. It was a night from hell. Your partner of 2 or 20 years sitting at the kitchen table. Next to them is a packed suitcase. And they say to you, I've had enough. I cannot do this anymore. I am leaving. So we won't go into all the details that might have led up to this conversation. Right, ouch. Things you can do at this moment in time that's going to make this a lot worse. A little bit more closer to home. There's the door. Ish, ouch, okay. Just say, okay, bugger off. Good, I'm going to phone my boyfriend. Ooh, ouch, nasty. Just silence, excellent. Walk past, shut the door. Very good, that's a classic avoider. Excellent. So you can see how easy it is. And any of you have ever watched, well, any of the soap operas, of course, if you want to write a good screenplay for anything, this is what we see. And the most important thing I want to close this half of the talk with is to become aware of the fact that there are these two modes. And the biggest thing I want to teach today is this dual awareness, because sometimes we don't click. Right now, I'm either in chimp mode or that person is in chimp mode. And right in that moment, there's a big vulnerability in being able to actually have a rational conversation. Excellent. Great. So now we're going to move to part 2. So in part 2 of this section, we're going to now start looking at